Okay, so this is basically a broad overview of the neural regulation, right, involving the nervous system. Let's talk about the hormonal regulation and the players here. So the hormonal regulation, basically there are 4 hormones we'll talk about throughout the course of today. The first one is gastrin, secreted by the stomach. It's going to have a series of effects in terms of releasing different substances. We'll talk about those. The second one is cholecystokinin, also called CCK. And we'll talk about the effect of cholecystokinin on the gallbladder and its effect on the release of bile. The third one is secretin. And secretin and CCK have a symbiotic relationship. They're working towards the same goal. They have the same effect, but they use different mechanisms to bring about that effect. We'll talk about the exact mechanisms. And then finally, there's GIP, or glucose dependent insulinotropic peptide, or GIP. All right, these are the 4 players that regulate the gastrointestinal system, regulate secretions, regulate motility, and they have an effect on absorption and digestion. Okay. All right. So let's talk about the 2 reflex pathways that are involved in the GI regulation. Right? So again, the intrinsic regulation is going to involve a short reflex pathway. And that makes sense, right? This is happening within the gut. It's being controlled within the gut. It's happening in the absence of any external factors. And so it's going to be a shorter reflex because it's all within the same area and being intrinsically regulated. The extrinsic regulation is going to be involving a long reflex pathway. Right, and so let's look at these 2 examples of extrinsic and intrinsic regulation. All right, so first up we have a stimulus. And that stimulus can be several things. It can be stretch, right? So the distension of the stomach, the stretch by the presence of food or a bolus that's moving through the GI. It can also be the presence of molecules, so those micromolecules we talked about, right? Monosaccharides, amino acid, that presence of those substances, and that is detected by a chemoreceptor. Chemoreceptor, if it's a chemical signal, a mechanoreceptor, if it is a physical signal, so a stretch signal. We also have osmoreceptors, if it's water, if it's the presence of water in the GI system, so osmoreceptors. And these receptors are going to initiate one of 2 pathways. Now, the first pathway is the fact that these substances, right, the stretch, the presence of food, the sight, the smell, the sound, not sound, the sight or the smell of food is going to activate the central nervous system, right? This cannot be avoided. So activating the central nervous system is the long reflex pathway. And again, I want you to think about the physical distance, right? Where the GI is from the central nervous system. And that'll help you remember the long reflex versus the short reflex. So the long reflex pathway takes us to the central nervous system, and the central nervous system is going to excite the autonomic nervous system. And remember the two divisions of the autonomic nervous system, or at least we should, right? There was the sympathetic nervous system and the parasympathetic nervous system. Now, which of these is going to potentiate this reflex? The parasympathetic, right? Parasympathetic. Remember that rest and digest. So the parasympathetic influence is going to potentiate this reflex pathway. And so what we see here is that the enteric nervous system will then be engaged. Right? Now, the short version of this is that these chemoreceptors, these mechanoreceptors and osmoreceptors can directly, I know this is kind of backward because the short reflex has a longer arrow, but remember this is the short reflex here. Right? So this short reflex is the shortcut to this process. So these receptors directly engage the enteric nervous system, right? In the absence of any central nervous system involvement. Right, so this is extrinsic regulation, taking the long pathway, engaging the central nervous system, engaging the parasympathetic nervous system, and then the short reflex directly engages the enteric nervous system. We also want to point out here that the sympathetic nervous system actually blocks this signal. So the sympathetic nervous system is going to decrease the effect of the enteric nervous system. Okay, and that's that fight or flight function of the sympathetic nervous system. Right, we're not too interested in digesting food or resting at that point if the sympathetics are involved. Now from here, there are two different pathways to a response, and we'll look at the two different pathways here. We can engage the endocrine system. And the endocrine system is unique how? What's unique about the endocrine system? What's different about the exocrine and the endocrine system? The endocrine system is going to release hormones into the blood. So hormones are released into the blood. And those hormones will have an effect on effector cells that will bring about a response. Or, in the absence of the endocrine system, the enteric nervous system can directly engage this response as well. It can directly have an effect on these smooth muscle cells of the GI. So here we have smooth muscle cells of the GI, right? So this is your effector tissue here. And again, this can be influenced by either hormones in the blood or directly by the enteric nervous system. And together, all of this is bringing about the same response, which is the increase or decrease of secretions, or the increase and decrease of motility. Okay, and these are our responses. So the big picture is that there are two ways to bring about responses in the gastrointestinal system. We can have a direct pathway where a stimulus engages a receptor directly to the enteric nervous system, which again are those two plexuses we talked about, the myenteric plexus and the submucosal plexus. And that will directly potentiate a response in the cell. The long pathway is we initiate the central nervous system. And again, this cannot be avoided, right? The sight of food, the smell of food initially stimulates the central nervous system, excites or potentiates the parasympathetic division, which then relays to the enteric nervous system. And from the enteric nervous system, we can go directly or we can engage the endocrine system. Okay. Any questions on this? Any questions? So this is how we regulate the motility, the secretions, the overall function of the gastrointestinal